Okay, so for cultural anthropology, chapter 1, we're starting with. Sorry, my camera shut off, so I'm just doing a quick review of what I just said. So, chapter 1, from Humanity and Peoples, anthropology is defined as the study of people meaning human beings, and so this class has anything to do with humanity. The five main categories are going to open up with are physical, biological anthropology, and that has to do with our genetics, our inherited traits, like we associated with race. One race of humans, right? Many ethnicities, but biologically, there is only one race or species of humans. Secondly, we have cultural anthropology, and culture is learned behavior. You're not born with culture. Culture has to be given to you, and that is normally done through our parents, through our schools, through our churches, and then through different in our cultures. A lot of it comes through media, through music, television. Think how much television or videos are purveyors of culture in modern American society. It's amazing, right? How influential they are on what we think is normal, what we think is beautiful, what we think is edible, what we think is good, what we think is evil. And those are all being put onto us by our culture. And the fancy word for that is called enculturation. And we have all been enculturated into one or more cultures. Thirdly, we have archaeology. And archaeology is looking at the past. And I'm just going to list these and then we're going to go into more detail on each one of them. The fourth one is anthropological linguistics, and I believe that's chapter 3. And what they're interested in is how language and culture interplay. And so they study different people groups. They're looking to see, are there universals that all cultures in the world share? And there are different universal grammar themes, which I find quite interesting. But there also are kind of like a window into the culture. And what these anthropological linguistics study is like, what kind of words do cultures use? How do they describe different directions? How do they arrange things? And all these things become like insights into the way those cultures, the language shows you the way they perceive the world.
Mr. Blackburn?
Yes.
Are they also speaking about nonverbal communication?
Yes, but
do they study those? Do they go into that too, or is it more just like the language itself?
We will cover that in the class, but these people are mostly looking at verbal languages. Not all of them have been written down, and we'll make those distinctions later as well. But certainly, you're absolutely correct. I mean, much of our communication, which is nice having this Zoom, is you can actually see at least part of my body language, right? At least from my chest up.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say is like in other cultures, like the way they express their happiness is a lot different than the way we do here. So,
correct.
Like communication is also nonverbal and like language, I guess, too. Like even like sign language, you know?
Yes.
I feel like even like your body, they say it's kind of funny. They say body language, but like it holds truth that like your body language is even, it can like express itself, you know?
Yes, very much. Thank you, Joseph. And there's a trip for you, right? You would think sign language would be universal, regardless if you're coming from a Spanish-speaking country, English, Chinese, but no. Even sign language has its own dialects and is different. So you would have, even if you knew American Sign Language, you would have to learn Mexican Sign Language if you wanted to communicate with people that's signed in Mexico. And so interesting to me. All right. And lastly, we have applied anthropology. And this is kind of like if you're just taken by this class and you want to pursue it, unfortunately, we don't have an anthropology major at the school at this time, but it shows you what you could do with like an anthropology degree, what kind of fields of work you could get into. All right, so there's the quick overview of the chapter, and let's just go through them one at a time now. So the first one, physical or biological anthropology. First, the book talks about biological evolution. And as you can tell, this is not coming from a theistic or a young earth creationist background, but the authors of this book believe in Darwinian evolution. They believe that we all came from a single-celled organism, and over time, all the species in the world came from that single cell. Humanity, coming in this kind of like tree of life, we go off on this like primate branch, and then there's a split between the primates and humanity, and our branch is called Homo, right? And Homo, of course, means same. So those are the species or proto-human species that we see as the same as us or leading to us. And this is part of why we have groups like Primatologists and things like that, because they believe if we came from, or there was a split and this is a similar early ancestor or offshoot of early humans, it might give us insight into human behavior and why we act the way we do. It's also going to talk about, like I mentioned earlier, the physical differences between populations. And this could be body types. If you notice people that live near the equator, normally they are like leaner than people that live closer to the poles in the more extreme temperatures. For example, if you see someone like from Vietnam or Southeast Asia, they usually have a thin build, medium complexion, usually dark hair, dark eyes, etc. As you get closer to the poles, if you like look at the Inuit, they are more squat, more body fat content. They actually have more veins in their hands than other people group. It's like an adaptation so they don't get frostbite in their extremities. I mean, if you took someone from the jungles of Southeast Asia and put them in the Arctic, they would freeze in very short order, right? But if you took an Inuit and put them in the heat near the equator, it would be virtually unbearable for someone of that body type or build. And so we do see this adaptation taking place within human beings as they are in different parts of the globe. Okay. All right. Another part of, see, am I still in this? Another part would be Paleo Anthropologists. And Paleo Anthropologists study human biological evolution. When I took the physical anthropology in college, we didn't even talk about human beings until after the midterm. The whole first half of the class was about everything from afarensis, which many people believe is where the split began, although I think there's a new one out, Rudolfensis? Anyways, it doesn't matter. After that split, we started with like Homo habilis to Homo erectus, then we got into different types of splits all the way up into Neanderthals and then Cro-Magnons. And so modern humans are called Homo sapiens. And some people are even advocating for a new category called Homo sapiens sapiens. So who knows, maybe some of you in the room are that next little twiglet coming off the branch of humanity of Homo sapiens sapiens. I think they have bigger, like bulbous heads for their enlarged brains and long fingers with like little pads at the ends, almost like space aliens, but I'm not sure. So paleoanthropologists, they're trying to look at these pre or proto-human fossils. Primatologists, these are people that specialize in the study of primates, and like I said already, it makes sense if you believe we came from or diverged from species of great apes, that there might be value in studying them to learn things about ourselves. Human variation, the study of the varieties we see which in the context of humans themselves. And once again, I thought that was incredibly fascinating, and coupled with a study of genetics, you can see what are dominant and recessive traits. For example, dark eyes, brown eyes, that's a dominant trait. So if you had a brown-eyed parent and a blue-eyed or light-eyed parent, I believe there's like a 75% chance that your offspring will be born with dark eyes, only a 25% they'll be born with light eyes. And then you can keep plotting that through generations where you could actually predict or get an idea of the odds of the outcome of your children looking a certain way. But there's always like these rogue buried genetic markers too, where you could get a surprise like out of the genetic woodpile and be like, wow, where did that redhead, blue-eyed baby come from? And it may have been part of your genetic markers on one of the sides of your families coming through. And then finally in this section we have what's called forensic anthropology. And this is where you gather information to determine things like age, type of death. When I was your age, there was a TV show called Quincy, where he was like a coroner, and he would try to solve crimes by using his skills as an anthropologist. And I remember one episode, someone found a skull in the desert, and they were able to take averages of humans, like how much skin is over your cheekbone, over your jawbone, the cartilage on your nose, and they were able to reconstruct with clay over this skull, and were able to actually get an image where they were able to ID a missing person who had died. And that's something like a physical anthropologist would do. I think there's a lot of shows like that now. What is it, like NCIS or something like that, where you have these forensic anthropologists using anthropology to try to solve crimes, find out causes of disease, etc. Oh, I did want to mention one more thing with the anthropology, or this is under archaeology. And so in archaeology, it's the investigation of the human past by evaluating and analyzing material remains. Archaeology. Now, the book makes a distinction, and I know this is on the midterm, so you might want to make a note here. One of the essay questions I ask, what is the difference between prehistoric and historic archaeology? Well, prehistoric, and I also want you to know the difference between hard data and soft data. So, prehistoric and historic. Let's cover that one first. Prehistoric means studying human remains of people or cultures before a written language. So if that culture or society did not have written language, you would be doing prehistoric archaeology. Technically speaking, at least according to anthropology, you could have prehistoric people living today, because prehistoric simply means before a written language. So if there's like some indigenous tribe in the jungle somewhere that has not developed a written form of communication, they would be considered prehistoric even though they are living in the 21st century. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Historic means there is some sort of written record to go with it, even if that's cuneiform or hieroglyphs, something of that nature. There's still a written account of the people and how they viewed themselves. And so that would be historic archaeology. Now, hard data is anything that is physical, material, tangible, something you can touch, see, smell, weigh, measure. So things like bones, cooking pots, spearheads, horse collars, any physical material thing, that is hard data. So think of hard as physical. Soft data are the intangibles that are associated with archaeology. So for example, you might find a grave site full, you have the bodies, the bones, you might have some of the deceased's favorite items, you might find a plate and coffee mug and utensils, or maybe their favorite pet. You might see food or some form of wealth stored or buried with the dead. So the hard data is all those physical things you can kind of list and number off. The soft data is kind of more inference. By seeing such a well-arranged grave, and you can see items put in there for the dead's use, we can infer or imply that, one, there's a great deal of respect for human beings. Two, there's probably some sort of belief in an afterlife if they're sending the person off with things they would need, like tools or food or cookware. And so those are inferences. So for example, in the Bible, it's a historic document, it's written, and we can read the Psalms, but we know that the Psalms were actually songs. But we have to infer what the tune would be because that's not included in the hard data, right? So that would be an example. It also infers, even though we can't dig up God, by reading the Hebrew scriptures, we can infer their belief in the supernatural, a high creator God that made man in his image. Those sorts of things would be soft data. So those are more like ideas, concepts, values, non-physical tangibles of a culture, where hard data is the physical, concrete aspects of a culture. Okay, pretty easy, right? Prehistoric, before written language; hard data, physical material. Historic means written language. Soft data is things we infer ideologically about them. Any questions about that first part, physical anthropology? All right. The next part, cultural anthropology. This is also called ethnology. The book is going to do the study of contemporary societies and cultures. Obviously, you could also study ancient cultures as well, but our book is focusing on cultures that are still existing today. I was a history major in my undergrad, and so I got a lot of anthropology just because of our study of the past, of archaeology, those customs, ideas, religious beliefs. In cultural anthropology, the emphasis is going to be on the cultural traits and variations. And remember, I told you already, culture is what is learned, what is given to you by your parents, your community, your culture. Cultural anthropology is, this is descriptive, and it's an attempt to understand, along with a promotion of toleration for diverse cultures. So I think this is the question I ask you to deal with in the discussion board for this week. What perspective is the book coming from? And this is it. It's coming from a cultural relative perspective. And I will talk more about that towards the end of the class. Actually, maybe this would be a good place to do it. Yeah, let me do it here. Cultural relativism is descriptive. It's simply telling you that in different places, different people at different times are going to behave in different ways. And it's simply telling you about it. It's not going to say, oh, this culture was so good or this culture is so evil. They're just going to tell you about the cultures. To the best of their ability, they're not going to put value judgments on it. So keep this marker in your mind. Cultural anthropology is descriptive. I'm sorry, not cultural anthropology, cultural relativism. But that is the approach our book is using. It's a cultural anthropology approach using cultural relativism. So they're trying to be descriptive rather than critiquing or evaluating cultures. Now, when you take ethics with me, we have an ethical theory called ethical relativism. And ethical relativism is prescriptive. It's telling you how you ought to behave. So, for example, when in Rome, do as the Romans. Each society gets to tell you its norms, its values, its laws. Ethical relativism is simply telling you how, like, the ancient Persians were different from the ancient Hebrews, which were different from modern 21st century Southern Californians. They're not going to say one is right, the other is wrong, etc. In ethical relativism, they would be saying, if you live in 21st century Southern California, that is the culture you need to adhere to. If you were living in 1st century Babylon, you need to adhere to 1st century Babylonian norms. So that is how they are different. And we also have moral relativism, which is simply saying morals and ethics are relative to place and time or to circumstances, like kind of like circumstantial ethics. So try to keep those clear in your mind. The book's obviously coming from a secular humanist, materialist, and then cultural relativist perspective. Let's break down those words real quick. What's a secular humanist?
Would it be somebody who just lives by like a secular worldview? Like they don't adhere to any form of ethical beliefs based on their religion?
Okay, right. They would have ethics, certainly, but they would not be religiously based ethics because secular humanists do not believe in the supernatural. They only believe that we are physical material beings. And so that's why you see an emphasis in this book on Darwinian evolution, because they don't have a creator God. They don't have a supernatural. They only have the physical material world. So they're trying to explain humanity in physical material terms. So I want that to be clear to you as you're reading this book. And you might be saying, why are we using such a godless book, Blackburn? This is a Christian college. Well, I think it's of great value because it shows you how many people, especially in the scientific communities and in the world, view humanity. They don't view us as some supernatural, that there's some supernatural being who gave us life and animated us and made us in his image. Rather, we literally came as a result of time and chance and different adaptations and mutations from very simple single-celled organisms to what we have become today. And we're still evolving at the moment. Who's to say what will be a million years from now if we survive as a species? So just be aware of that as you're reading through the book. But you should be reading critically anyways. I mean, if you haven't learned not to be a sponge by this point, God help you. I will help you. And for heaven's sakes, whatever I say in this class, don't believe it just because I said it. I mean, critique it. For half the time, I'm not even teaching stuff I believe anyways in here. I'm trying to teach first person. So when we go through these different theories and perspectives, I'm trying to give you the strongest version of it as I can, rather than like a Christian straw man version of it that I can dismiss without much trouble. So I want you to see why people believe we evolved from or split off from the great apes. I want you to understand why they care about primates. I want you to understand how they're going to try to make up value judgments about human beings. But they're coming from a very different worldview than a Judeo-Christian or theistic worldview. All right, onward. Field work. A major part of cultural anthropology is to actually go out into the field where you study is conducted within the context of a people group. You live with them, you eat their food, you learn their language, and as much as possible, you observe them from the inside, right? So you're not trying to sit in your ivory tower and look out through the window and then write all this stuff you think you know about a people group. You come down from that intellectual tower, you go out into the world, and you actually live with people that are different than you. And this is what I'm hoping we can do if this COVID thing lightens up by midterms, we'll just see, is I want you in small groups to actually go out and do field work in a culture or subculture here in San Diego. Now, if we still don't have that freedom, we'll find some virtual way to do it. Maybe we'll look at virtual subgroups. And there's plenty of those, right? We have all the right and left-wing media sources and their devotees. We have all sorts of clubs and groups that have online access and variation, different religious groups, different like we could even do like subgroups like surfer culture or steampunk culture, or there's just a wide variety. And I'm not that aware of a lot of internet cultures, but you guys are all technology natives. I'm an immigrant, so in this you would probably be way ahead of me on the curve. But we'll see how things are progressing at midterm before we get into that. And then finally, ethnography, writing about that people group. And I'm asking you guys to write a 10-page report, but this is a group report. So if you have three, 4 people in your group, you're only looking at 2.5, 3 pages a piece, right? So this isn't a huge thing, but I want it. You can pick one of your group members to be the editor, and they can compile it, because I want it presented as a formal 10-page research paper, with the whole 9 yards, right? Thesis statement, concluding paragraph. I want resources. I want bibliography. I want all these things incorporated. And then you'll put everyone's name in the group onto that paper. So you'll be sharing the grade. And I know you might be thinking, no, Blackburn, I hate group projects. Well, welcome to life. I mean, I get to do lots of group projects here at the school and my different committees and meetings, and it's just good practice learning how to work with people. You always have your go-to person, right, that wants to get it done, super organized, and you usually got some lagger, and so you're going to need to figure out how to work with those. And believe me, if you have someone who's not doing their part, tell me as soon as you can, and I will get on them. I mean, confront them yourself nicely and say, hey, I really need you to pick up your part of this class. But if they won't respond to the other members of the group, I will be more than happy to encourage them strongly or remove them from the group. And so use me as a resource, but hopefully as more of a last resort. But do it early. Don't wait till the week before the paper's due and say, Bob hasn't done one stinking thing all semester and he wants to ride on our work. And that's a little late for me. I need to know earlier if I need to encourage Bob or Betty or whoever isn't sharing their weight. Any questions on that part, cultural anthropology? The whole book's going to be on that after we get through the intro. So there's going to be a ton of cultural anthropology. All right, the next is anthropological linguistics. And this is the study of human languages. Philology is the study of language. Philology. But that's a whole separate school of thought. They would be looking at roots, language types, systems. This is going to be looking at how linguistics interacts with other types of human behavior and how it separates us from other primates. So, for example, we use different speech patterns and different intonations with different people. For example, when I'm talking to a little baby, I'm talking very differently than I'm talking to, like, the president of the college. When I'm talking to a little baby, I'll usually bring down my vocabulary. It might be just googly sounds and funny noises and lots of physical gestures to interact with that child, that pre-linguistic child. But if I'm talking to, like, a peer, I'm going to have a more sophisticated language. I'm going to treat them as an equal. I'm going to be speaking in even tones. But if I'm talking to a superior, I may actually tone down my language. I may speak slightly softer, a little less demonstrative. I might avert my eyes a little from those in authority over me. And so we've learned different social cues and norms, and even in our intonation and the words we use are different around different groups of people. Like how you talk among your friends and peers might be very different from how you talk in front of your mama or your teacher in the classroom, right? And I'm amazed at my own children, how they can, like, sometimes when they don't know I'm listening, I'm just like, woo! It's like they could make a sailor's ears turn blue, but they can just turn it off when they're in my presence, which I appreciate. But I notice they have very different language in very different contexts and who they're communicating with. So that's one of the things they study. Another question they ask is, does the way people refer to objects and their environment tell us how they believe about them and about those things. And I think it's really interesting, like what different cultures, which words they'll hold with like reverence and have high honor, and which are more in disdain. Um, like certain cultures, for example, Italians have incredible regard for their mothers, and the language they use when talking about their mothers might be much more reverential or filled with a type of awe or holy fear than other cultures might refer to women or their mothers, where they may not have as high status in those cultures. And so that's what the anthropological linguist is doing. They're looking at how people use words and using it to infer things about the culture itself. Another example would be things like taboo words. Each culture has a list of words that are taboo. Can anyone tell me what a taboo is?
Something that is wrong or looked as wrong.
Yes, thank you, David. And it's so wrong, we usually don't even like to talk about it. It's like that kind of creepy in our culture. So a couple things that would be like taboo in our culture would be something like incest, bestiality. We don't even want to talk about that. I mean, for most of us, we've been brought up that that's so outside of bounds that you're probably not going to have discussions like that normally. It's a taboo topic. But we even have taboo words. And these are forbidden or improper words you are not supposed to use, which is weird that we have words we're not supposed to use, right? Because someone had to make them up. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you a list of taboo words in our culture, but I did just learn recently, actually just last semester, I learned the difference between profanity and obscenity. Now, they would all come under the category of what we would call like curse words or taboo words in our culture, at least in polite society. But would anyone like to take a guess at the difference between obscenity and profanity? Here's a clue. Oh, was someone going to ask? A clue is, think of what the word profane means. That will give you a clue to what profanity is. Or obscene, right? Obscenity. So some words are obscene, but others are profane. What makes something profane? Here's one more clue. The profane is the opposite or the antonym of the sacred or holy. Come on, talk to me. I can't hear you, Regina, if you're talking. There you are. I'm sorry, not Regina, Rhea.
It's okay. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. My thought would be that profanity would be maybe bad language or, words that we consider to be bad words versus obscenity maybe would be more crude language or like crude descriptions of things. But because it's the opposite of sacred things, I would imagine that the definition would probably be more like a perversion of something that was good. So
there you go. Right. Now, both of these are like, they're taboo words in our culture, at least in polite society, right? Now, they may not be taboo in your social groups, but in general culture, you don't use certain words. Profane words are where you take something that is holy or sacred and you drag it down into the commonplace. So that would be like taking the Lord's name in vain, or using like Jesus's name as like an adjective or a descriptor instead of as the Son of God. Or it could even be using things like heaven and hell as descriptors, like saying, if you say something like, what did I just see? I just saw an advertisement for some California food company, and I think they're calling themselves Hell of a Salad or something like that. But see, it's taking something like the seriousness of hell and it's turning it into a common descriptor word, like saying "what the hell," or "God damn it," or something like that. When we say something like that, saying "damn it" or "damnation," that literally means wanting someone or sending someone to hell. And so when I'm driving around with people and they say something like, "damn Sunday drivers," I'm like, do you really want people that are driving poorly to burn for eternity in the fiery pits of hell? And they're like, "what are you talking about?" I'm like, "what are you talking about? Do you even know what the words mean that are coming out of your mouth?" And that's part of my problem. I was raised Baptist fundamentalist, and we were taught a literal historical hermeneutic. So when people are using profanity, you can imagine my disdain when people start dropping the F-bombs, right? And you start taking those literally, and you're like, "what are you saying?" And they're looking at me like, "are you from another planet?" But that's what a profane word is. It's taking something holy and dragging it down into the gutter. Obscenity is like potty talk or sexual talk or crude talk that really isn't appropriate in whatever context you're using it in. So I guess I would put it this way. If you must curse, please be obscene rather than profane. Okay, and moving on from there. We'll get into more of those later. Actually, I got 15 minutes. I have time for a quick story. Years ago, a group of our students went to Belgium to work with a missionary. I think there were like 5 or 6 of them, and he picked them up at the airport. And then as he's taking them back to his house, the whole trip he is just swearing up one side and down the other as he's weaving through traffic and all that. And our poor little Christian Heritage College students back in the day were like traumatized. They're like, "good Lord, we're here to serve this missionary in Europe, and he's got more swear words coming out of his mouth than anyone we've been around." And they didn't want to say anything, of course. They're the guests. They're there to help him. But over the course of the summer, they just saw what an incredibly godly, loving, kind, spirit-filled person this was. And they just could not reconcile what was coming out of his mouth with what they saw were obvious fruit of the Spirit in his life. And so one of our students, when he was getting brought back to the airport to come home, they had developed enough of a relationship, and so he actually felt led to confront him. And he said, "it's obviously you love Jesus, you have the Holy Spirit, but why do you use such filthy, obscene language?" And the missionary was truly taken back, and he said, "what are you talking about?" And the guy said, "the whole way you speak is just full of curse words." And he said, "I learned English by watching American movies and TV, and so I thought that's what you said, like when a car cut you off or when someone knocked over your drink at a table. I was just trying to be culturally relevant to my guest." And so it was simply a misunderstanding because they weren't curse words to the missionary. They were just English words that he was using in context he saw from American cultural displays. And I just thought that was such a wonderful example. So, let me give you an example. One of the worst British swear words is bloody. But you could say, "oh, I'm tired of this bloody class," or "all this bloody traffic," and we don't think anything more of it because we weren't raised in the context of that being a horrible, obscene, taboo word. But if you said that in England, now, most English people I've met truly have taken swearing to a whole nother level. And I'm talking men, women, children. It's just so much a part of the culture. It's quite shocking if you're not used to it. But for them, that's kind of a doozy. And I'm not trying to be crude, but the reason it's such an offensive word because it has to do with a woman's menses. That's where that word comes from. And so to roll that out, it's really kind of a crude, graphic, obscene word. But in English, in America, we don't have that cultural context with that word. Does that make sense? Okay, good. So even swear words, taboo words, are culturally determined. Culture is so powerful. Moving onward. Applied anthropology. I got 10 minutes. We're doing good. Applied anthropology would be things like cultural resource management, where you locate sites of prehistoric and historic interest and you try to preserve them. We have a lot of these in the United States. In California, you'll see like little brass markers as you drive down the highway. And they could be preserving anything from stagecoach tracks that came across the desert to an old historic inn or maybe some Indian burial site. And this is part of what an anthropologist could do for a living. Another would be contract archaeology. In 1966, the National Historical Preservation Act was passed, and this is where we attempt to preserve the nation's history and past. And so you could actually be hired on as a consultant or an evaluator of certain sites. Medical anthropology. This is the interaction between health, nutrition, social environment, and cultural beliefs. So, for example, in Jewish and Islamic cultures, they have very strict diets associated with their religion and their cultural beliefs. And a medical anthropologist or a nutritional anthropologist would be looking to see, is there a connection between their cultural beliefs about food, like what's clean, what's unclean, what's halal, and what's not, and well-being and thriving. We might look at people in Japan, right, who have a high diet of seafood or seaweed, kelp, mostly a vegetarian diet. Does that have an impact? Their beliefs, their culture, with their physical well-being. Another would be developmental anthropology. And this is where governments and corporations use anthropology to help problem solve and avoid conflicts. I mean, imagine how much better our diplomacy and things would be if you understand the culture that you're interacting with. Because in some cultures, you could end up offending them simply out of ignorance. For example, in many Middle Eastern countries, the right hand is clean, the left hand is unclean. So if you try to shake someone with your left hand, you're already off to insulting them before you've even begun the conversation, right? And so it's really helpful if you have an anthropologist to come in and explain to you some of the norms, some of the culture, some of the values of the people you're trying to interact with. Educational anthropology. This is where you observe, record, and analyze human behavior. You look for and understand cultural assumptions, values, and beliefs that underline behavior. And this could be incredibly helpful. Like some of you are thinking of going into education or being teachers. If you don't understand the difference between like your Chaldean kids, your Southeast Asian kids, your white Anglo suburban kids, that's going to be a problem, right? You could end up inadvertently doing things that was very offensive to those students or their parents, even though from your worldview or your culture, you were being quite appropriate and sensitive. And so it's really helpful whether you're in business, in government, in education, or even just living in California where we have so many diverse cultures, to learn enough about other groups so you know if you're being offensive or not. I mean, you're not doing it simply because you don't know any better. And that's I'm also part of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee here at the school. And I've done a lot of surveys in the last couple years. And for the most part, at least the feedback I've gotten, I haven't sensed a really strong feeling that there's overt prejudice or discrimination here at the school. Like people aren't just coming flat out and saying really hateful, racist, or disparaging ethnic things to one another. But what does happen is people will ask questions or they'll say things that are really ignorant and they can be really hurtful. And so part of what I'm trying to do with not just the students, but also with faculty and staff, is to help educate people more about different cultures. I mean, like, you don't talk about a black woman's hair, right? Or you don't touch a black woman's hair. But if you're not from black culture or society, that may not be something you intuitively or instinctively know. And these are things we have to learn and share about each other. In some cultures, you don't touch another person. You respect that personal space. Or it might be gender related. You don't have physical contact with someone that's not in your family or a close relative. And so these are all really helpful things if you plan to travel or if you plan to live among other human beings that are not the same as yourself. Okay, 5 minutes. Here we bring it on home. So, cultural anthropology today. In the past, part of, like, if you were getting a master's degree in anthropology, you would go out, and your dissertation or master's thesis would be actually going out, living with another culture, and then writing up a report about them, and then adding that to the catalog of our knowledge of different people groups and cultures around the world. Well, here we are in the early part of the 21st century, and there are very few, there may be a few out there who undiscovered people groups or ethnic groups, but for the most part, the people of the world have been researched, studied, categorized, written about. So many modern day anthropologists who are doing their master's work are now focusing on subcultures, because subcultures are arising all the time. We get subcultures popping up as a reaction to the broad cultures they're living in. And I gave you a few examples, I think, our first week of class. Here in Southern California, we have subcultures like surfer subculture, right? We got the bro subculture in East County with the flat bill hats and the big jacked up trucks. We've got steampunks. We've got lots of fusion like Chicano culture, right? These little subcultures that aren't like typical mainstream Mexican culture, but they're like these little subgroups within those cultures. And think about how diverse like Hispanics are, not just in the United States, but in the Latin world or the Latino world. And I think it's really helpful and interesting, and that's what I would encourage you to do in this class when you do your field work. You're welcome to do a major culture, but I'm super interested in these subcultures or even countercultures that arise over time. All right. So here's some of the perspectives the book is going to point out. One is a holistic perspective. This is where you look at connections and interrelations between human beings, things, and how the parts interrelate to the whole. I saw there was a really neat book at Barnes & Noble. It was called Material Culture. And in this book, they were simply looking at the physical material differences between different people groups. And so they might have some Bedouins from Saudi Arabia bring everything out from their tents and put it in front so you can see what they have. And then they might go to suburban Illinois outside of Chicago and have their family from the suburb do the same thing. And then they might do it in Peru or China. And it was a really interesting way to look at culture. But instead of just taking the material, what about their ideas, their concepts, their values, their beliefs? And a holistic approach would say you can't just look at the physical or the ideological, but you have to put them together if you really want to understand, hence the word holism. And I think that's a wise approach. We have comparativism, and that's what cultural relativism does. It generalizes about humans, but it must take the full range of cultural diversity into account. And so we talked about cultural relativism is descriptive, and that's what the book's going to do. Ethical relativism is prescriptive. It tells you how you ought to behave. And then finally we have situational relativism, which is kind of like moral relativism or circumstantial ethics. And we already talked about ethnocentrism the first class, but that's my last word to end on. So my goal with you in this class is, by learning about other cultures and your own culture, that it will help you be less ethnocentric. And ethnocentrism is like racism, but instead of judging people based on their genetics, you're judging them based on what they have been taught. And so we're going to try to help you avoid ethnocentrism. It doesn't mean you can't critique and evaluate other cultures, but it will hopefully get you away from blindly stereotyping or categorizing or labeling other people simply because they're not like you. All right. Thanks for joining me for Chapter 1. Please read Chapter 2 for Wednesday.